Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, an independent podcast that dives into the world of zero trust and tells the story of people who are adopting it. Throughout our series, we'll investigate why zero trust is becoming a critical concept for cybersecurity. Our hosts, Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis, will have transparent and open conversations with the people driving modern security approaches forward, while leaving vendor hype behind. It's time to remove implicit trust and buzzwords and get to the root of the movement.
All right, everybody. So thank you so much for joining us. We are at our first initial episodes of Adopting Zero Trust, or as we will be continuing to call this, AZT. It is a podcast, obviously, about adopting zero trust. Part of our goal here is really to be an independent voice where we're chatting with folks like our guest here, Andrew, to really get a better understanding of what zero trust is. So today, if you do a quick Google search, first few pages, you're going to mostly see vendor information, and that's great. They play a key role in adopting zero trust. But at the end of the day, we want to talk to practitioners who are actually implementing it, having conversations with peers, and really just being able to help guide other individuals who are, going to be in those same set of shoes. Obviously, on the U.S. side, the federal government has instituted in the next 2 years, they want to move towards a zero trust model. We're seeing things like just this past week, which at time of recording is just this past week, NIST has put out a new concept for a framework that they want open for public opinion. So we're seeing more and more organizations like this come to the table, and it's just becoming very much more real. But that's enough on my end. I'm just the guy who helps put this together. I'd love to get our two actual voices here doing most of the talking. So, Andrew, I'm actually going to kick this to you. I absolutely love your background, and I don't want to destroy what I see on LinkedIn. So I'm going to kind of let you give me the spiel, and we'll dig a bit more into your story.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. And it's great to be with you guys today. So thanks for having me along. And I've been looking forward to having a chat for ages. So it's great to be here. I guess the zero trust thing for me, I've always sort of been in IT for a long time, not always in security, but what's really been the main interest for me has always been strategy and business alignment. So sort of when zero trust came along, the more I learned about it, and I've always been more of a student of the traditionalists around zero trust, like the NIST and the CISA and the CIS and all of the sort of non-partisan, non-vendor I guess theoretical versions of what zero trust should be. So the more I read about that from that perspective without the vendor spin on it, the more interested in it I got, and the more I could see a straight line between what business needs to grow and secure itself and protect itself from threats, and what zero trust had to offer. So that's the thing for me that's really attracted to me initially, and now, as I say, the more stuff that comes out, and even in the US, I follow it quite closely, and the philosophies and the evolution of what NIST is putting out there, it seems to be really on point for me about driving businesses forward and aligning that security and business goal.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is a fantastic outlook, because at the end of the day, again, most people are going to run into conversations with vendors and their perception, but there's just so much more out there, and it's a little bit under the top layer, so to speak. But before we kind of get more into your story background, Neil, I'm going to make you reintroduce yourself, at least for the first dozen episodes and probably another 100 more. Obviously, we have episode 1 where people are going to get to know you, but what's your background? What is Mr. Co-host here doing and learning about zero trust?
Yeah, I'm along for the ride. So for those tuning in, if you miss our little fun intro slide that we do as episode 0 here, I'm literally approaching this from a technologist perspective. I'm an Intel analyst. I strive to learn new things. I try to keep my technology background in focus with cybersecurity demand and figure out where things are growing, what they might be doing, where they've lagged behind. And so for me, coming from that perspective, I am genuinely curious about fact or fiction or middle road reality of what zero trust really is today versus kind of, Andrew, you already mentioned this lightly. You saw it in the past, probably before the term was even really coined, but the concept of what it really implies to do things. So that's where I'm at. I'm really curious about what we've already done before we started coming up with the new phrases for all this stuff and where we might be going courtesy of the new marketing spiels and things like that, and the mandates that are coming out globally. So yeah, holistic approach, very technology focused, pure curiosity play. So thanks for enjoying it with us, Andrew, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation, man.
For sure.
Awesome. So yeah, we're gonna basically just throw a few questions your way, but otherwise, this conversation will just go wherever it ends up going. But that being said, you have obviously a background working with some pretty large technological organizations, and now you're more the utility side of the world. So you've seen probably the flavors left and right as far as like how vendors approach things versus practitioners and internal. But I love just your general take on zero trust. Like when it first came across your desk, what did that look like to you? Was it is this too good to be true, or yeah, what was that?
Well, to me, it looks like it sort of seems to be an umbrella that all good decisions fit under nicely. You know, like people who have been in security over a number of years. Even Neil, you mentioned the analytics side and all of that, and that I have a massive amount of respect for people with those skills. But that's one sort of slice of the one vertical, the whole cybersecurity thing, and then you've got your identity stuff, your devices stuff. So to me, it feels like we're all out there doing our sort of vertical of security to protect the organization, but zero trust in its purest sense, in the way it was designed as a philosophy, I think is that sort of overarching umbrella that fits across all of that, and you can line it all up and give it some direction and give it some, apply end states and target goals and business strategy alignment to what we're all out there doing sort of individually or, in silos previously. So that to me is where it's at, and that's why I like the NIST stuff. That's why I sort of focus on it heavily as a business tool rather than a security tool. I look at it as a way to protect the business, to make better decisions, better security decisions, but based on your business's assets. So that's why I sort of think, well, when a vendor comes along, and we spoke before about RSA, and every second vendors don't trust, do trust, maybe trust, zero trust, all of that stuff. So beware vendor bearing gifts, I say, because unless anyone knows your environment and what you're trying to achieve, they can't come in and by magic drop a zero trust solution and off they go.
Yeah, I think on that note, the solutioning concept, right, for me, that's an interesting one, because you have all these larger companies that have been around for a while that have done some kind of implementation around various degrees of security, whether it's gateway security, the new EDR, XDR concepts, all that stuff, left, right, middle, all that stuff. And now everybody's slapping the word trust something on it, right?
Yep.
One way or another. And I think hindsight for me is there's not a magic bolt to anything ever, right? And if you're buying one, you're probably buying the wrong tools, or you're going to be upsetting a lot of people downstream in security stack. But that being said, thinking about more of a holistic approach and piecemealing the zero trust concept together with multiple vendors instead of trying to rely on a single solution, right? I mean, kind of curious, that approach and that thought mechanization.
Yeah, I think that's where it comes back to sort of understanding your assets. Like a Windows 10 laptop is a Windows 10 laptop, and you can apply a million different vendors' products to that laptop to do a million different things. But at the end of the day, you've got to decide as an organization what you want that device to do production-wise, productivity-wise, and what posture you want it to hold security-wise. So if you're in obviously if you're in a government role, you've got to have a high level of security around data and various bits. If you're just using that laptop to sign people on at the front desk, then that's a different concept, So I think that's where the beauty of it is that if you understand what your business goals are, then you'll pick the right product and the right vendor to get to that outcome. Because, I've seen many, many times over the years that companies, what they think they want to do is totally, they bring in a vendor because they want to buy a horse, and then when the vendor's left, they've got a camel and they don't know how to ride it. So, you've got to make sure that the vendor's giving you your solution to your target, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's no joke. I think that's just words to live by across the entire security stack and product requirements. I know we've got a list of things to think about here, but on that note, you mentioned loosely requirements in a roundabout way, right? So kind of thinking it from an Intel analyst perspective, I don't like to do my job either government side or private sector side without an actual requirement, plural, mapped out somewhere right? Whether I'm sitting at the tactical level or the strategic level or somewhere in between, I like to be able to map things out to both the actual risk inside the organization I'm supporting, understand the threat verticals, but then map that out to leadership, what they understand around risk and dollar signs, right? The actual dollar value. So I think
Yeah.
that's a good point. You need to make sure you're not buying a camel when all you really need is a poodle.
Yeah, exactly.
Today,
Yeah,
maybe you still
yeah,
need the camel for something larger in 6 months, but if you haven't really
yeah,
mapped it out right, you
yeah,
got the wrong
yeah.
saddle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. And that's the other problem that we probably all see as well, that, you kick off a project, you think you want to do something, you get pretty close to it, you deliver it, and then everyone goes home, but then someone's got to come along and operate it and clean up the mess. And then no one's built an operating model. So I sort of talk about, we do network impact assessments to check bandwidth in the old days and all that kind of stuff. But new stuff like an operational impact assessment has to be done. So you're putting in this product, who's going to operate it? Have you got the headcount? Have you got the skills? Are you going to create 100 more service desk tickets a day because the process is rubbish? All that stuff. So that's and again, part of the zero trust thing, which is the beauty of it, that you can fit it to your organization. You might say, like, we've got a bunch of really smart guys who do a lot of open source stuff, write a lot of their own codes, do their own cloud DevOps stuff, so we can morph our environment in the zero trust context to support our strengths, which is that. And another environment, you might have a different skill set or a different philosophy around how you treat stuff. And I think the risk question is a very important one, because again, that varies. Some like financial institutions, obviously they all understand business risk, but the financial risk and organizational risk and reputational risk are very important. But for other organizations, it might be the risk of ransomware or a loss of production or something else. So that risk is so varied across different organizations as well. And it's all stuff you need to understand when you're sitting down to do zero trust. I think it's all outcomes and where do we want to get to? How do we want to operate? What are our strengths? All that stuff.
Yeah, your analogy, I think when you were chatting with Chase Cunningham, I think it was, you wouldn't use a hammer to bake a cake, and obviously he took a
Yeah,
kick out of
that's
that.
it.
I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
I mean,
that's
at the
it.
end of the day, it can't be about tools and technology.
No.
Yeah. So I think the take that you have is focusing on the business alignment as a huge element of adopting
Mm,
zero trust.
mm.
So I think from my end, I'm totally curious, like, internally, where did that conversation start? So obviously there's interest on your end, knowledge, but,
Yep.
is it top to bottom? Is there, what was the buy-in process like?
So I think that's where people sort of like me, architects and strategy people and then security people in general, when it comes to introducing zero trust to your organization, sometimes need to be a bit creative, because in my
Mhm.
experience, the people who understand it and want zero trust don't necessarily have the seniority to fund it and approve it. And the people who do have that seniority don't necessarily understand it. So, there's a way to introduce it. And one of the things that, one of my pet peeves, I guess, is security people just spinning out buzzwords, to try and impress, well, maybe not impress people about how clever they are, but I mean, presented as a security concept and people's eyes roll back in their head, because I'm big on translating the security stuff into the business language, because business leaders are hired to run the business. They understand the business language. So you need to make the effort to, articulate your strategy in a language that resonates with them. So I think, but to get back to the creativity bit, so for me, we had invested in an identity platform to manage identity. So I didn't come in as here's zero trust. I came in as, here's an identity operations strategy. And then from
Mhm.
there, it morphed out. And other people might have really good network controls or SASE or something like that. And then you can go in that way and say, look, we've just heavily invested in this network thing. I don't think we're fully leveraging our investment. There's some zero trust concepts I'd like to apply. This is what I reckon. And then you can, like, that creativity can then let you spread out and say, I might talk to the device guys about how this network thing that I'm planning impacts devices, and you just go from there. So you're doing almost zero trust by stealth, but again, it comes back to that. It's basically just good decisions and good security. That's happens to be called zero trust sometimes.
So you kind of hit on something in my bailiwick a little bit, and around collaboration, internal in
Yep.
particular in this element, right? Coming from your side of the fence as well a little bit, I've definitely done my fair share of manipulating, in a polite way, the chains that be and the lines that be to try to get buy-in from a lower echelon before the leadership realizes what's happening. Maybe not necessarily be the best approach, but if you're in charge of doing something to keep something secure, the people at the end of the day that have to respond to whatever it is that you're creating alerts around or creating work around, those are the ones that you really need to get your buy-in from, and then hopefully the leadership follows along. And in a lot of situations, it's always nice to go top down in these types of structures, but sometimes bottom up's a good approach. So collaborate, coordinate, and then take over the office space.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a very good approach as well, because like if you go to someone senior that's going to approve a budget for the next financial year or whatever, the first thing they're going to say is, who else is on board with this, or who have you run this past? But to your point, Neil, exactly what you just said, if you've got, well, I've been through the device guys, the network guys, the cloud guys, and everybody's on the same page, then it's got a lot more legs straight up than you just saying, oh, here's my latest idea, let's do this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, once again, from an Intel perspective, again, from my side of the fence, that's a unique posture to be in from an Intel analyst side, trying to help promote these things. So nugget for anybody who has an Intel analyst on their team or someone playing at one, get them involved in these processes sooner than later. Let them help you map out risks, both top to bottom. And they can be a good point of education to the teams as a whole and help message out what needs to be messaged out. But on that same vein, the collaboration element. You start talking to someone about how to make their life less complicated. And next thing you know, when an event kicks off, they're there helping make your life less complicated, right? With the tooling.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that analytics side that you've mentioned there is absolutely core, because one of the drivers for all of us when we all start our zero trust on the obvious ones, identity, device, network, blah, blah, blah. But the holy grail for it is to move from incident response and reactive incident management to proactive and real-time analytics, and that's where the EDR, XDR, that telemetry, and to me, I see a lot of the value in zero trust is building that bridge between that real-time analytics and telemetry information and response to incidents and threats and the business, and saying, look, this stuff is our goals. This is our real-time knowledge about what's going on in the environment, and we just need to build a structure around it and put some controls in place and some processes under the zero trust banner that really bring that to the center of what we're doing. So that's a big thing for me. And again, that language of the business. In the old days, you had the developers in one corner of the room and the Unix guys in a different corner of the room, and IT off not talking to either of them, then the business somewhere else, and nobody knew what each other did, but you just hoped it came together at some stage. But these days, that doesn't cut it anymore. We've all got to understand the business, and we've all got to be able to speak to business leaders. And I know in the US, I think there's a rule coming in, isn't there, about board directors have to have cybersecurity knowledge. So that's going to accentuate that as well. That'll need to continue on.
It's focused on some key elements that slipped into the omnibus bill, right? But it's a seed planted that's going to grow probably across the board regardless, but it's very fixated on critical infrastructure and key resource pieces that we define over here. So 13, 14, I don't remember how many industry verticals, but for like electric and power, right? Energy sector, financial services, things like that. So if you're in those, congratulations, you do have a legal requirement to have someone on your board that speaks cybersecurity.
Oh, yeah.
So I mean, you bring up a point going from reactive to proactive, and so you kind of touched on this a little bit already. But if you think there's something to kind of expound upon how zero trust a little bit more takes you from that, right, where the core competency allows you to bridge that gap and do that more specifically.
Yeah, I think that, a bigger part of it is around, and again, it comes back to how it all ties together. So, for example, if you've matured your identity section of zero trust and you've got a good handle on your organizational roles, we've defined a bunch of identity types where I am non-human and human. So, I think if you can define, and that's another thing I'm big on, is apply organizational roles to non-human identity. So define their scope, apply the identity compartmentalization to the network segmentation concepts as well. So all of that comes together in terms of being able to limit what a compromised credential can do, where they can get to, or even in normal operation, what they can get to as well. So once you've defined that, you can then link that into your device management, your XDR, EDR thing. So you're looking for that anomalous behavior where, you go, look, this identity hasn't tried to connect to this thing in the last 8 months of operation, and now it is. So that's the real time, proactive vibe that you can pick up from a good zero trust environment, where it's not overly a bunch of complex tools. It's more philosophy business principles and stuff around, and that's stuff that should just apply anyway. When you hire someone, you should have a good idea what you hire them to do. Or if you're buying a new truck or buying a factory, you should have an idea what you want it to do. So, yeah.
So one more quick curiosity then on that note. So you kind of talked about identity access control, obviously, which is a very big key component. But do you see the whole passwordless security movement and the way it ties into zero trust competencies? We've got this whole heuristic approach to access control management that's growing momentum. I mean, I talked about on the pre-call here a little bit about Gartner and all the zero trust companies that are there. But oddly enough, I did see a decent amount of people talking about the whole passwordless environment, right? I think Google corporate, I could be wrong. I thought I read an article about Google corporate starting to field this passwordless environment in a test phase at their corporate office.
Yeah, Apple actually just announced biometrics related stuff so that users can move towards passwordless as well.
Yeah.
There was actually this kind of weird Twitter thread that popped up over the last couple of days where people were like, I think in a perfect world, it sounds like people would love it, especially on the hype for the user side, because they don't have to remember passwords. They don't have to use password managers. But in the US, and I don't know how this impacts outside of the US, but obviously passwords are protected under law and privacy policies, but biometrics are not. So I think that opens its own kind of weird worms here in the US.
Yep. Yeah, that's it. I agree. I think that it's a good example of one of those concepts where the technology gets ahead of the cultural willingness to adopt it, kind of thing. Like, from a technology point of view, like you just touched on, Elliot, it makes sense and it works definitely. But from a cultural point of view, people are a bit like, oh, what? No more passwords. After we've been using passwords for 30 years or 40 years or whatever, it's a bit to get their head around. So, I think there's and just on the, the biometrics as well, there's some sort of trepidation, I think, from general users and the public around that biometrics and who has access to my facial recognition and where does it go, and and also I guess the new concept is the decentralized identity stuff that is out in the market as well. I'm very keen to see where that goes and how that manifests in sort of 18 months time kind of thing, where that goes.
So I'll say one more thing on this. Once again, the perspective of having like a heuristic learning algorithm based off of a user profile is extremely intriguing and scary, all in the same vein. We're talking about more than just like a fingerprint and a facial recognition when we think about what passwordless security is trying to imply. And I think we saw the antithesis of this, the network defense model of this, maybe probably 10 plus years ago, where companies were trying to come out and fingerprint your user base, but not use it for direct authentication, but use it for the trust models, use it to define, hey, this user hasn't logged into this server in 8 months. So this is all precursor to zero trust in my brain.
Yeah.
But define what the user's activities are, even define how they hit the keyboard, right? And make this fingerprint of a digital fingerprint of a day in the life of someone in that seat. And then when that fingerprint moves from here to another system, or when that fingerprint changes from that solution, being able to flag things, right? Kind of like what you're talking about in general zero trust constructs here. So, I mean, at least from my perspective, I think it's kind of a unique, fascinating growth curve in what we were doing 10 plus years ago to try to stop a threat actor from taking over your laptop and usurping your Google profile or whatever it was, Microsoft Office back in the day.
For sure.
Anyway, kind of curious about that.
No, I think that's a really good point, and it just sort of didn't finish with the machine learning and the AI and all of that. Like, it's not, you have to give it some rules as well, and the rules have to be based on what you want your environment to run like. It's not like Data or Star Trek where you just turn it on and it works it all out for itself and makes all these brilliant decisions and stops the ship from blowing up. You've got to give it some basic rules to follow to make decisions at the moment anyway. Obviously it'll evolve over time, but yeah, I think that's definitely something to consider. And again, vendors will tell you, just use AI or machine learning to do all this. It's like, it's not quite as simple as that, but yeah.
Well, it's another one of those adages again, what's old is new again. Because I remember in 2006, 2007 was when the whole rootkit thing really kicked off. And we had people accessing your BIOS chipsets and all this other stuff to install all of these persistent BS things. They were, whatever they were. But from APT before it was defined APT to just some kid in the basement that just realized he could hack a chip, right? Whether it was your GPU, whatever, right? But all that to say is the machine learning, natural language processing capabilities that we have today, moving it back even further than just that heuristic fingerprint of a user. In 2007 and 8, we had rootkit discovery, and the whole concept was based off of heuristic learning, right?
Yeah.
So building core competency, I think maybe starting on that level historically, and then that turned into figuring out how to fingerprint a user to keep a bad guy from usurping that profile, which is now built into helping you and I potentially just do our day-to-day livelihood without having to have 5,000 passwords and 20,000 browser tabs open so you remember where you're at.
Yeah. I think that's a big thing, and one of the things I talk about is transparent security. So I think that I don't think zero trust should be pushed as a security control thing, and I think the security should be transparent, so it's applied, and the security people and the people responsible know it's being applied, and traffic's assessed and all that. But from a user's point of view, they're just doing their work. They don't see the security. Like in the old days where people complain constantly about, I can't do anything and can't access this, can't do my job, So that's the evolution. I like to think of zero trust as like a new payroll system or whatever. The CEO comes in and says, we're going to invest in this new payroll system. You're all going to get paid more efficiently. Your holidays are going to be recorded, and everyone buys into it, and it's done across the organization just as a thing, So I think that's where zero trust has to be as well, just an organizational thing that everyone buys into, and that's helped by not pushing it as here's a new security thing we're going to do.
Yeah. So actually building on that, and obviously with your background in identity, I'm curious how that plays a role. So you can technically enter zero trust into an organization in a dozen different places, but from what most organizations, Forrester, Gartner, they'll kind of throw out IAM and identity IDP as a good entry point, because you do your risk management, your risk profiling, and then you build an inventory of all of your assets, devices, and people. Where in your mind do you, again, you might lean towards that, but is that the ideal place? Or should you look at what your most active priority projects are and try to adopt zero trust into that? So does it make sense to have a foundation or go after what you're already needing to go after?
Yeah, I think that it does. So I think that at least up to this point, the problem that zero trust has had is being able to demonstrate value and return on investment in organizations. So I think one of the reasons why Forrester and big companies sort of say identity is because everybody's got them, so a good zero trust project to me is one that spends the first year even demonstrating value, decluttering the environment, tuning processes, doing more with less, saying, this guy, this process has currently taken us 12 hours or 2 days to do. We can apply different controls and different processes and do it in half that time. So I think that's, to me, if you if you start with identities, devices, and connectivity, and particularly in connectivity, identity aware network controls rather than firewalls and stuff like that. I think if you start in those three areas, they're typically the easiest areas for most organizations because they're already in that space. Not everyone has a strong cloud footprint with workloads, for example. Not everyone has developed SIEMs and SOCs where they've got a good analytics and telemetry and threat protection capability. But I think if you can, say if you've got an Active Directory, if you start even with your service accounts as one of your non-humans and you tune your service accounts to limit what they can log into, eliminate interactive logins, that kind of stuff, you can demonstrate value straight away and say, look, we've started in the identity space because we've got some, and we've done a bit of network stuff, and we've tidied up our devices. We've tightened up how much stuff runs on them. We've improved even our GPOs so they're more secure. We've used CIS benchmark scores, all stuff that's readily available to demonstrate value. And then from there, in your second and third year of zero trust, you get into your sort of heavier concepts around applications and workloads and stuff.
Very cool. So kind of building upon that, I'm curious. So obviously zero trust is not just technology, it's also education and trading. So beyond those questions, which I'll definitely be poking around at. So I'm curious, as you're looking at adopting it, be it identity, network, wherever that entry point is, what does the resource shift look like? Because obviously there's education, training, technology involved. should the goal be focused around obviously reducing efforts, automating, but just in general, what does the general scope look like when you're starting to adopt zero trust, between education, training, getting other people involved in the process?
Yeah, I think that it's sort of from for the general users, it goes a bit beyond education training. That's very important, but it's also a cultural thing, where
Mhm.
you sort of develop a security culture, and that's not make everybody, able to jump on and do some coding or whatever, but it's make people aware of there's, usually a secure choice to make and a less secure choice, like who do I share this document with? How do I move this document around the network? How do I present information, that kind of stuff. So it's that cultural thing. But then internally within the security and broader IT teams, I've talked about operating platforms that are operated by security. So like your EDR, XDRs typically can be operated by the SecOps team or whatever. And the other side of that is operating platforms securely. So if you have an EUC team that might operate things like Intune or some device management portal, they're not security people. They're not necessarily in the security team, but they have a platform that where, the security posture of the devices, which is at their control, is crucial to the overall security posture. So I think that that's where the big resource shift that I think you're talking about comes from, because typically and I've been in EUC before as well, and typically if you're running System Center or Intune, it's all about enablement and productivity and getting apps out to devices and letting people do their job. But these days, it's such a focus on security posture and risk as well that you need to understand, well, these are my security capabilities in the platform that I'm operating, and these are the better choices I should be making. I should be doing a monthly. When there's a new iPhone come out, I should be looking at all the new policies. I should be checking how many devices are out of compliance, what are my policies, all that stuff. So I think, it's not feasible for every platform in the organization to be run by a security person in the security team. So all those platforms that are run outside of security, there needs to be a sort of a gradual evolution to security thinking of how those platforms are operated, so those platforms become operated securely.
Yeah, so I think that actually begs the other question. Is there a threshold for like team size and capabilities to be able to actually truly adopt zero trust? Because today, everything on the market technology wise is definitely positioned towards enterprise or somewhere around enterprise organizations where they have full on IT folks, dedicated security personnel. They have those resources and capabilities, but what does that look like as far as what you've seen? Do you think realistically smaller organizations with less resources can adopt it, or if it's just kind of piecemeal?
I think most definitely it is suitable to everybody, because I think it's contextual to the size of your business. If you're a bank with 100,000 employees, then obviously you've got a different context to if you're a law firm with 30 people with 30 computers. I think that when you look at, and one of the things I love about Zero Trust is that it is a philosophy like TOGAF that you can bend and customize to what you want to get out of it. So if you're an accounting or a law firm that's got 30 people, you should certainly look at Zero Trust. Pardon me, because you don't need to invest heavily in it. Let's go out and buy a new Palo Network bit of kit or whatever. You can just make better decisions. Let's let's harden up our endpoints, or let's refine our processes, or let's tune up our Active Directory or whatever we've got. So they're all zero trust controls that you can put in, and they may get you to the threshold of where you need to be in how your business operates. So it's not about investing a bunch of money in new technology or platforms or hiring a bunch of security people. It's about just making it fit right for your organization. So everyone can do it, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest point there. Is it doesn't necessarily have to cost you more money, but it can save you money long term.
Exactly. Yeah. For
At
sure.
scale of economics. And so let's I have a consultative background. I used to work for a really large consultancy firm for several years after I got out of the military. And one of the things I loved about the firm I was at, we didn't try to find new problems to make more money. We tried to find new problems that needed to be solved simply to do it.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's money that goes along with it. And I think that what you just mentioned from a scale of economics perspective, a rather robust amount of people, especially in that SMB space, that small business side, don't need to go out and spend even $5,000 or 50 or 500,000 to get to the concept of zero trust. They just need to have one semi-intelligent person on the team that understands what it means to do security the right way.
Exactly.
And pick that up, like you mentioned, as an idea, not as a financial burden.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, and yeah, it's all about the context as well of who you deal with, how you operate, what information you have, and again, all the concepts of we have, credit card information for customers, we have merger and acquisition information, we don't have that, so it's all about understanding your business in the to me, identities, all that, they're all digital assets, just like physical assets in the old days of buildings and desks and computers, so you've just got to inventory all your digital assets and make sure they're protected, so it's exactly what you've just described. So
yeah, hopefully it's easy for some people.
yeah, that's it. I was just going to say, talking about investing with vendors, and I was just sort of RSA, like all the vendors will say we've got a zero trust solution, but they're obviously, some are strong in the network space, some are strong in the identity space, some are strong in the operating system space, but they don't typically tend to sit across everywhere, which is where, I think, Neil, you mentioned before that it has to be a mix, which is exactly right, because you can't just go with a vendor. And we flirted with a vendor's view of what zero trust was, and then when we really kicked and punched it, we realized, well, hang on, that's your view, but that doesn't solve all of our problems, so
Yeah, that's once again, that's the biggest piece here. So RSA versus us at Gartner, like I mentioned last week, instead of RSA, got to avoid that hell of a loo over that RSA and trade it in for Gartner. But that being said, like I mentioned, on the floor, at least half the vendors out there, whether they were in a tiny little booth or whether they were in the big floor booths, had some mention of something trust related, trying to spin off a zero trust when they didn't really know what it was themselves. So they would say, Identitrust is obviously a brand, but it's also a concept. We had people that were literally touting around just no trust. Come and learn how to do no trust society or whatever. I think so. I think the concept of what zero trust is at its core is, ironically enough, is still being figured out by the vendors. Some are leveraging it as a buzzword so they can try to upsell their current offerings with their new zero trust technology, quote unquote. Others are just trying to actually approach the problem and provide, to your point, a chunk of the solution. But nobody that I'm personally aware of can effectively map out the entire security or the security structure and mapping of all your assets and things that you need to do that. You can bring in a consultant that does a lot of that for you and tells you which vendors to bring in if you have the money to do that, but you're not going to find a single solution for everything. You can find one guy who does networks very well. Maybe that's where you start off with, stuff like that. But using that approach to know you need to piecemeal this together is very critical too.
And you raised a very good point before around the resource types and the people that play a role. Like, to do zero trust, you really need, say, a good process person. You need someone who understands risk. You need a good BA. You need someone who understands applications and networks. And so it's not even like the process and risk people may not be security people per se. They may just be, good business process people that can analyze how the IT and security processes to respond to incidents currently operate. So their output is gold in terms of a proper zero trust strategy as well. So you have to be creative. You have to be pragmatic as well. I think that's the other problem that people have is, sometimes security guys and vendors come in and say, you must do this and you must do that. And it's like, well no, you must not. You must do what works for you, and you must be pragmatic, and keep an open mind and get creative, because I think that's where the best solutions are. Creativity and pragmatism mixed together is where the best solutions come from.
Agreed. I think to that point, you really only have two primary options. You either realize that your team, even if they're just getting started, is your best resource for anything, not just your team, but the other teams within the company as a whole, wherever they're sitting. If they touch, to your point, you may not be a security guy, but you may touch a digital asset, right? Or a connected asset. That person potentially still has a say in how they think that asset can be better. And then the other flip side of that is taking the time, if you really want to take a more holistic approach, bring in an actual consultant, not a firm that does zero trust, but a person who understands the concept from the outside in and can help review that by leveraging your team as well. So I think there's two core approaches other than just going right out and trusting the first vendor that says zero trust is awesome. Here, let me do it for you. Take a time to step back and review your options a little bit more.
For sure.
And then back to what we mentioned earlier, work to get buy-in for the people who actually have to do the job.
Yeah. And leverage that culture as well, because like even in the old days before Zero Trust came along, we all had similar problems. Like no vendor is ever going to be as invested in the success of your business or your outcomes as you are, or the process person, or the service desk person, because or the CEO, because ultimately there's that people are people, right? They're invested in where they work. They want to succeed. They want to do well. So a vendor doesn't have that, despite what they might say. So leverage all those resources, all the people that know the lay of the land and where the bodies are buried, get them involved and get that information, because that's the key.
Yeah, exactly.
So spot on. So change of direction just a tiny bit. So I know that you've got the lovely, probably only piece of paper that would say you're a true zero trust professional, which Forrester provides. Just morbid curiosity. What was that like? Would you recommend that experience to other folks?
Yeah, I don't know how. I might be on shaky legal ground, but I thought that certification, I thought it went away for a while, and now I was on a Forrester website. I'm actually talking at a Forrester event later in the year, and it seems to have come back again. So there is, I did the Forrester Zero Trust Strategist certification, and I really liked it actually, because the main thing I liked about it is that it's the Forrester view is all about risk, right? So for me, that was a good sidestep into an area I hadn't really explored as much in my career. So they talk about for every dollar you invest in a zero trust project, this is the return to move the risk needle lower, that kind of stuff. So it was all about justifying the spend on zero trust projects by reducing the organizational risk. So it was really good. It talked about how to deal with the board, how to present things up. So I learned a lot from it. I thought it was fantastic, and in fact, it was probably the main thing that clinched my love of zero trust and interest in it. So I do highly recommend it. I think that the NIST stuff is sort of Puritan about zero trust concepts with their domains and their principles and tenets and all that, which is brilliant. I think the Forrester is a great complement to that because of the risk focus, and I think the Gartner stuff is great as well for that sort of, this is what the market is doing and this is what you need to consider in the real world kind of thing. And then obviously your vendor bits on top. So
Yeah, very much so.
yeah.
I'm curious, are there any other organizations that you've seen that have done a good job of sort of packaging up with being more vendor neutral, platform agnostic, elements like that? Like Cloud Security Alliance is obviously out there doing their thing. Open, I think they have a zero trust program that they have in place and it's been up and running. But what kind of resources would you throw out to folks who are, again, just trying to look at adopting zero trust and kind of meet to where you're at today?
Yeah, so I think like what we touched on is you need to understand what you want to achieve clearly in your head and have it written down, and then you can bring in vendor products and stuff to achieve that. But so when I wrote the strategy for where I am, I looked at obviously NIST, CIS have done a lot of work. They've got the 18 controls, or I can't remember what's 8 or 18, but they've got a bunch of controls around it. CISA, and then the cloud alliance as well as in there, Forrester, Gartner. So I guess start with those ones. The John Kindervag stuff, Chase Cunningham, they're both guns, obviously fathers of zero trust. So read all their gear. Chase has got plenty of stuff out there on the internet, so you're not short of content. Follow up with that, and then try and stay away from the vendor stuff until you feel that you understand what you want to achieve with zero trust and what it means to you, and then talk to you. Obviously we've all got vendors that we deal with, no matter whether you're big or small. There's usually the few of the same suspects, so start talking to them, but don't lead in with, oh, we want to get into zero trust. Can you explain it to us? Because I'll explain.
I think you hit the nail on the
ideology.
head. Yeah. I mean, Neil and I both work in this space and deal with sales folks, so we can sling the mud and take it back our way. But I think bringing vendors into any conversation at that early of a stage tend to be a bit of a mistake. I mean, there are some that can probably walk you through it. They might have experts and consultants on staff, but again, I think the resource that you threw in front of folks is probably the right direction. And then making sure again, business need and business alignment there is there first. Do the research and then start having those conversations.
The
for
vendor
sure.
is definitely there to coach you into how to use their product.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think that that's the other thing to bear in mind is as you start to learn about zero trust and look at the domains that identity, devices, information, network. I've evolved it even in our organisation, so I don't call it data, I call it information for a specific reason. I don't call it networks, I call it connectivity for a specific reason. And then your telemetry and analytics and all that stuff that you layer over the top. When you sit down and look at a cloud application, you go, well, is it workload or is it networking or is it identity? You've got to sort of understand what that means and where those delineation points are for your organization based on your processes. So again, it's boring mapping out all those processes and assets, but you've really got to know it to make smart decisions. Otherwise, you end up like with the camel, like we talked about before. No one who wants to learn how to ride a camel when there's horses everywhere. The only other thing I'll say is to keep an eye out on the internet. I know I'm personally involved in a couple of things that are coming up around zero trust groups and meetups that are about to kick off. So look for those LinkedIn groups. Look for groups where you get sort of impartial advice from other people that are going through the journey, going through exactly what we just talked about for the last hour about where do I start, how do I get involved, and look out for any of those sort of resources you can get your hands on. Watch the podcast, watch the demos, go to the conferences, and use that to help build the picture in your mind.
I'll add to that slightly. If you're U.S. based or at least affiliated EU, U.S., get involved in the ISAC and ISAL world as well. That's wonderful reference points. If you're not EU, US, or somewhere else where you can get involved in those, I know there's the Australian CERT, for instance, POC Prod. Those people like to talk about how to make life better. And most countries have some form of a CERT or some form of government component that's similar to what DHS is attempting to offer from just a free learning environment and collaborative environment. So I think those are also relatively good resources for whatever neck of the woods you happen to be living in.
Yep, exactly.
Awesome. Very cool. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is going to be probably one of the best ways that we could kick off this series. Your expertise, your educational background, it's definitely where I think a lot of people will want to be in the future. So you're ahead of the game, and being able to share that insight with folks is going to be very important.
No, great.
At the end of the day, at the end of the day, Neil and myself were students of this, and we're just trying to help facilitate these conversations. But again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of that expertise.
No worries. Thanks for having me. It's a great chat and really enjoyed it. Thanks, guys. Good luck with the rest of the recordings.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Cheers, guys. Thanks.
Thank you for joining AZT, an independent series. Your hosts have been Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis. To learn more about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Slack community. Viewpoints expressed during the show do not reflect the brands, employers, or companies of our hosts, guests, or potential sponsors.